The people of Taiwan have lived under the threat of Chinese invasion for decades now, and that threat has only intensified in recent years. Well, now the people of Taiwan are voting for a new president, and at the heart of this election is the question, what's the best way of dealing with China? The incumbent party, the DPP, says that Taiwan needs to stick to its tough line against Beijing, that that's the only way to stay strong. The opposition KMT, which hopes to get back into power, well, it says there's a better way. It says it's important to get friendlier with Beijing to reduce tensions. Well, we've come to speak to the last KMT president of Taiwan, Ma Ying-jeou. He was president from 2008 to 2016. He says that he knows the best way of dealing with Beijing, and it's a much friendlier way. We're going to talk to him and drill down on why he thinks that Taiwan needs to get friendly with China to reduce the risk of war. President Ma, thank you so much for speaking to DW today. You have, and the KMT, your party, you presented this election as a choice between peace and war.
Yeah.
Can you explain that view?
Well, the candidate for the DPP, Mr. Lai Ching-te, is a person who supported Taiwan independence for many, many years. And he has always vowed that he wouldn't change his position wherever he is. So I'm sure the guys in mainland China will be very nervous about a person like this. And so far, Mr. Lai hasn't really talked too much about his Taiwan independence approach, but everybody was alert.
But Vice President Lai, who's running for the DPP, has made it very clear that he would not call for independence. He says that Taiwan does not need to call for independence, that it is already effectively an independent sovereign country. So there is absolutely no need to do that. He says he represents continuity from President Tsai-ing-wen, who is now leaving office. Do you believe he's lying?
Well, his name is Lai. No, I think they are afraid too. They are afraid that they would the kind of the provocation is not very good for Taiwan, and particularly I'm sure he has received some advices from our friends in the United States too.
I mean, do you believe that there could be a war if the DPP wins this election?
Not necessarily, depending on what happened during the process and what they would say just in case they win the election. And people expect that the DPP will take a lot of care in avoiding any potential conflict. So they try not to be provocative.
So, but you have said this is a choice between war and peace. But from what you just said, it sounds like, well, maybe you don't think there will be war. Can you just clarify a little bit? What is your position here?
As I said, one of the candidates is a lifelong supporter of Taiwan independence. Although he has toned down his words during the campaign, but the impression is there for over 10, 20 years already. So people will see how much he will change if he is really elected as president.
I mean, the way you're putting this suggests that you put the blame on the DPP and on William Lai for the current tensions across the Taiwan Strait.
Right.
Isn't it China that's really to blame for this? I mean, it's China that sends warships close to Taiwan, that flies warplanes across the median line now. The provocative military action is coming from China, isn't it?
Have you visited Taiwan when I was president?
No, I didn't.
So you didn't know. At the time, the cross-strait relations is so peaceful. Now we have signed 23 agreements with the mainland, and cross-strait visit done by over 5 million people. We have some problem with the mainland for sure, but never reached the stage of military action. But the DPP is different because they have a lifelong belief of Taiwan independence. That is the biggest no-no from mainland China. So they watch the candidate, watch the actions very attentively.
So this is all the DPP's fault? you believe?
To a great extent, because they advocate Taiwan's independence. This is something which is absolutely unacceptable to the mainland.
But President Tsai has also been very clear she's not advocating declaring independence. She says that Taiwan does not need to declare independence, that she defends the status quo.
Well, for those of us who watch the politics every day, I think this is it's merely some slight changes of its position regarding Taiwan independence. But if you ask anyone in a political circle in Taiwan, understand Mr. Lai has been a supporter of Taiwan independence for so long, and he said many times that he said he will uphold my position wherever I am. So this is something, it's like a new politician who has no political path for you to look at. So that is why I think, if you ask me which one is more responsible, of course mainland China is responsible, but DPP also has its responsibility in making the situation it is today.
But you say that China is responsible. I mean, so far you've been highly critical of the DPP and not been critical of Xi Jinping, for instance, for threatening to use force to attack Taiwan, for mounting massive military operations around Taiwan. What's your message to China? Is that all just totally fine? Like, no, the DPP is the problem?
Both sides are responsible, of course, both sides. But when I was president, this kind of thing didn't happen. Why is that?
Well, the DPP would say that you were far too friendly with the Chinese, that you went far too far in trying to build connections with the Taiwanese. This unleashed a student protest called the Sunflower Movement, where young people came out on the streets and said that you were getting far too close, that you were putting Taiwan's autonomy at risk.
Well, for anyone in Taiwan during my presidency, understand, we have relatively peaceful relations with them. So it's entirely different from what it is today. That is why I asked you whether you have been here when I was president. If you were, then you can make the accurate comparison between the two.
But it's clear that the people ended up rejecting that, and for 2 terms they voted for the DPP, and potentially current opinion polls suggest that they will vote for the DPP again.
Well, if that is their choice, then they will have to be prepared for some kind of actions from the mainland, which we already warned that TPP candidate, what kind of trouble they can make if they get elected.
And would you see that as justifiable by China if China mounts military action of some kind, some
Not
sort of
justifiable,
threats? Yeah.
But it could be avoided if we do something right. That's my position. I'm not saying that DPP should follow what the KMT did, but at least as a leader in Taiwan, they have to take care of the mainland very carefully. That is why about 2-3 years ago, President Tsai says, mainland China and Taiwan, he said, we don't actually belong to each other. And this, in my eyes, as an international lawyer, this is a typical secessionist move. She doesn't have to say that. When I was president, I didn't say anything like this. But everything they said could always be interpreted as something for Taiwan's independence. And they knew very, very much that Taiwan independence issue is very sensitive in cross-strait relations.
Well, let's move on. We'll move on later on to talk about the whole idea of one China, which I think is really interesting. But I think we want to move on now a bit more to what's at stake in this election. Now, your party's candidate, Ho Yo-yi, has talked about the need for 3 Ds in dealing with cross-strait relations. He talks about deterrence, he talks about dialogue, and de-escalation. Deterrence, dialogue, de-escalation. So we want to talk about all of these 3 areas, but I think first of all, let's talk about deterrence and the importance of having a strong military to deter China from mounting an attack.
Mr. Ho's cross-strait policy, by and large, follows mine. And at the time I said, no unification, no independence, and no use of force. He adopted all this. Of course, what you just described is a new, but not different version of his policy, and I support that.
So let's look at the deterrence part of that first of all. So having a strong enough military to deter China from taking action. Do you believe that Taiwan right now has a strong enough military to provide effective deterrence?
Well, the question is how much protection you need. For the current situation, I think what we have now is relatively okay. In case of some military action across the Taiwan Strait. Of course, if you want to do more, you could do more. But the most important thing, in my view, because I've been president for 8 years, and I know how to handle mainland China, we could use peaceful means to do that. It doesn't have to resort to everything military.
Yeah, so I guess that's moving on to the de-escalation part of it, but let's just talk about a couple of aspects of deterrence first of all. There's been a debate about military service in Taiwan. So the DPP extended compulsory military service to 12 months. Hou Yu-yi, your candidate, last year was talking about reducing that back to 4 months, and then he seemed to change his position again. What's your view? What is appropriate in Taiwan as the period of compulsory military service?
I think it's very natural for people, particularly people from the United States or from the PPP, to view the military service of 4 months as too short. But it's all my term is 4 months. I did it all right because we don't want to use force to solve problems with the mainland.
So you would like to stick to 4 months, you think? Yeah.
Why not?
Okay. Hou Yu-yi has also talked about military spending, so this is also an issue. Currently around 2.5% of GDP. Hou Yu-yi has talked about gradually increasing that to around the level of 3%. Do you think that's appropriate?
Well, if you look at what I did when I was president, we didn't spend that much on military. Because we have established dialogue with mainland, not just for higher up levels, but for all the ministries. They have their counterparts in the mainland. So everything, in case of any problem, they can always find a way to solve it without having to resort to force.
So you think 2.5% is enough?
It's not necessary. If we can develop a peaceful and closer relations with the mainland. Well, I think the most difficult or most problematic aspect of that policy is you believe that force is important or necessary, which we consider is not incorrect, but doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, but we are talking about the 3 Ds. Your candidate has said that, and deterrence is the first of these Ds. It comes first. From what you're saying, you want to reduce the importance of deterrence with military service or military spending and increase the importance of, say, the dialogue and de-escalation. Do I understand you right?
Right. Do you know why I think that way? Because in the last couple of years, the DPP has never had a dialogue with the mainland.
Yeah, well, that's because the mainland. That's because the mainland, China, refuses to talk to the DPP.
But not only because of that, but the DPP does not accept the 92 consensus.
But we'll talk about dialogue in just a moment. I really want to stay with deterrence for a moment because what you've said is leave military service at 4 months, 2.5% of GDP is sufficient. So it suggests that your approach to deterrence is not really to go any further. You think just really focus on other elements?
Do you know why I believe that way? Because no matter how much you defend yourself, you can never fight a war with the mainland, and you can never win. They're too large, much stronger than us, so we should use non-used military means to reduce the tension. And this is something the people of Taiwan would like to have, the people of the mainland would like to have. So if you always believe of a strong defense, it's all right, but in the situation of Taiwan, it would be very dangerous to our people.
Well, it's in the point with Taiwan's military expenditure is that Taiwan would need to be in a position where it can fend off a Chinese attack for long enough that then the United States, maybe Japan, come and help.
That is too optimistic. The mainland China military is much larger than us. And if you know the RAND Corporation of the United States, they have done a exercise of hypothetical warfare 18 times between U.S. and mainland China. All 18 times, U.S. lost.
So it sounds somewhat defeatist attitude in terms of approach to the military that I'm hearing from you, that you feel that deterrence is almost impossible?
It's very difficult, and we should not put all our fate in defense. We have to use peaceful means to dialogue with the mainland so that we can reduce the tension. You know, so I don't know whether you know, I visited the mainland early this year, and which has been quite successful.
Last year, 2023.
Yes, and so I think, so we try to reduce the potential reason for conflict, and instead of building up our military, just to wait for a potential conflict with the mainland. That's very dangerous. People will die, you know.
If China does mount an attack, do you believe the United States would come to Taiwan's aid?
That's the question we ask every day and didn't get an answer. I don't think the U.S. will directly involve, and they will try everything to avoid it, because if they get involved and have a face-to-face conflict with the mainland, that could lead to nuclear war.
Joe Biden has said 4 times that he would come to Taiwan's aid. He has gone beyond the traditional ambiguity that the US has had towards this question. Do you not fully believe him then?
Well, I think it's very difficult for the US to make that kind of decision, because if a war breaks out across the Taiwan Strait and the US is involved, so that would be disastrous. And so we should try everything to avoid hot war between not just Taiwan and the mainland, in order to prevent war between the U.S. and mainland China. As I said, according to Rand Corporation's simulations, 18 times all the U.S. lost. So there's a limit of the U.S. support. So we have to understand that very clearly.
In the US, that's leading a debate on how important it is for the US to invest more in its military, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. You think that that's a mistake then, is it?
No, I think military preparation should be done, and it should be done well. I'm not saying that we don't want that. We want that, but we can not depend on that. When your enemy is mainland China, there are so many times our size and much stronger in the military. So we have to understand that very clearly. And that is why I advocate the peaceful resolution of the dispute. During all my term, I'm doing that. I visit the mainland, I try to make friends with them, and we try to actually promote closer ties. And this is probably the best way to not using force to solve our problem.
Let's move on to the second D, dialogue.
Dialogue. You met Xi Jinping himself when you were president in 2015. Do you think he's a man Taiwan can work with?
It depends on how you work with him. I think yes.
How should Taiwan work with him? As you know, after 8 years of your presidency, a lot of things changed. A lot of people say Xi Jinping, he changed himself.
Well, actually, it's very important of the concept of 92 consensus, one China respective interpretations, which was reached in 1996. And that gives the two sides the opportunity to maintain the situation without having to go to war. And we understand very, very well, if the war ever breaks out across the Taiwan Strait, it will be disastrous. Nobody will win. You know?
Yeah, that's what I mean by this change, because in 2019, when he talks about 1992 consensus, he said it's the consensus that will be used to push for unification, and that's what he said, right? Like a lot of people, or like even people from KMT, think that it's more and more skeptical to negotiate under this consensus, and it also becomes more and more unpopular here in Taiwan, especially among young people.
Well, I think I think not just the young people, but people in general would actually misunderstood the 92 consensus. During my term of service as president, 92 consensus is the very important political foundation between the two sides, and that served us well. We not only never have a situation to go to war, but we expand our peaceful contact in almost every aspect of life. And this is probably the best way to do. If you only think about war, conflict, and so you build a lot of weapons and make a strategy oriented against to war, I think that's not the best strategy for Taiwan at all.
Is Xi Jinping a dictator, as Joe Biden says?
Huh?
Is Xi Jinping a dictator, as Joe Biden put it that way?
Well, it depends on how you defend it, but that term doesn't mean not very important in the cross-strait relations, because we have to create a situation that we can deal with each other peacefully without having to use force, and that is probably more important than any other rhetoric you have.
So you think you can trust him?
Well, as far as cross-strait relations, you have to.
Mm-hmm. But then again, for this New Year speech, you talked about unification is historical necessity, and then so from his side, he's keep pushing like the process of unification. And under the circumstance, you still think that's?
I don't think he's pushing for unification. You know, of course they want China's unification, that is for sure. But he also understands very well that unification cannot be achieved overnight. It will take many, many years. It has to get the consent of the people. So when I went to the mainland early this year and met with the officials, I told them that for the relations between Taiwan and the mainland, I think it's very important to look at two factors. One is peaceful, another one is democratic. Unification is something that our constitution says. So it's actually acceptable to Taiwan, but it has to be done peacefully and through a democratic process. If that can be done, the chances are the people in Taiwan may be interested in accepting that.
Mm-hmm. You talk about your visit to China last year. Do you know your image is used in Chinese military's video to promote unification? And in that particular video, they show their arms, they show their ability to conquer Taiwan, and your image is in it. So doesn't that show like CCP is using you to divide Taiwanese from each other?
Oh, they've been doing that for a while. I wouldn't think that will stop my thinking of trying to reduce the tension across Taiwan Strait. As far as China's reunification is concerned, it could be a long process and has to get the consensus of the people. So it's not something you could achieve in a couple of years or even 10, 20 years.
Yeah, you're talking about the consensus of the people. So if we look at the poll, for example, from NCCU, you know, like during your 8-year presidency, actually much more people identify themselves as Taiwanese than Chinese, especially among young people. Do you see that as a trend? And also these people, they reject the idea, not only one country and two systems, but also 1992 consensus. So the population here, the people here, they're telling you, we don't want this idea anymore.
I think it's very important to let the young people understand what is the essence of cross-strait relations and what does 92 consensus mean to them. I think 92 consensus, as I said, means one China, respective interpretations. But the government here, DPP, always says 92 consensus is just one country, two systems. No, it's not at all. We and myself are opposed to one country, two systems. But I accept 92 consensus. There are two different things.
Mm-hmm. So from your point of view, what is it like a unification, a real like far sight that you can see that will happen?
No. It's going to take a long time. But the most important thing, before we reach that end, the process will be peaceful and democratic. If we can do that, I think the people of Taiwan probably will accept that.
Will there be a possibility that there will be a Taiwanese independence?
Oh, I don't think that is something that people in Taiwan are doing or want to do. I think the majority of people understand Taiwan independence in cross-strait relations is something very, very dangerous.
From the poll, we can see only less than probably 2% of the population think unification is possible. And most of the people, they want stay at the
Status quo.
The way it is, the status quo.
Fine.
But that's also because of the threat of the war. But if you ask people, there are still more people supporting independence than unification.
That is unsure at the moment. If they understand independence means war, which is true.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Then,
so at the moment, people in Taiwan don't want unification. That's okay, but I don't think people of Taiwan will support Taiwan's independence, and they probably, at least some of them, understand. If they do that, that means war.
Mm-hmm. Now let's talk about de-escalation. Do you think the U.S. is being too aggressive toward China?
The U.S.?
For example, having Nancy Pelosi visiting and then selling weapons to Taiwan, all these different moves.
Well, I'm sure, of course, mainland China is opposed to U.S. military relations with Taiwan, but that's something that we don't really take that very seriously because they've been doing that for more 70 years. But we have our own defense, and we have to defend Taiwan, no doubt about that. So we want to purchase adequate military hardware from the United States. Of course, this is opposed by mainland China, but that we probably should overlook because we have our own defense.
What about Nancy Pelosi's visit? Do you think it was a mistake?
He's a friend of the Republic of China, but she probably didn't know very much about cross-strait relations. Or she thought that she knew, but she didn't.
Because after her visit, a lot of things changed.
That's
there
right.
are war plans coming across the median line.
That's right.
So you do think it
That
was
is
a
what,
mistake?
That is what we had. I think our government, I don't know whether they have at least politely let the people like Nancy Pelosi know their visit to Taiwan doesn't really help our defense at all.
Mm-hmm. From Nancy Pelosi said, she thinks that it's important to show her support or the American support to democratic
Taiwan. We
Taiwan.
thank her for her support, but it has to take some other means to do it, because she doesn't even know how to understand the cross-strait relations. This is something we sometimes worry about. Some of the Americans, they say we have to give every Taiwanese an AK-47 rifle to defend their country. I said, oh my God, our rifle is much better than AK-47. We manufacture the best rifles comparable to M16. So they didn't understand the situation and make a lot of sometimes ridiculous comments,
So if you
which
were
we don't appreciate.
If you were at the position, you would say no to her.
Huh?
If you were the president, you would say no to her.
That's right. I think, as I said, they come to visit us to show their support. That we appreciate. But for how we should do to make our relation with the mainland acceptable, probably we know more than they do.
Now it comes to U.S.-China relation. There's a growing consensus in the U.S. that it is a new Cold War with China that will last for a generation. Do you believe that is the case?
Not necessarily. It depends really on how the two sides could handle the relations. I don't think, we don't think we want to have a war with the mainland. I don't think mainland want a war with us right now. But they, as you know, is a nationalist. They probably will take any further action in Taiwan very seriously. So we have to be very careful. We have maintained good relations with the U.S. for over 70 years. As you know, they used to have military advisors in Taiwan. And they retreated in 1981 or something, and not troops, just military advisors. And so we appreciate the support, and we still purchase a lot of American arms for our defense. This is something mainland China also opposes. But that, we think, is our country's defense, so we insist on doing that. But we don't have to use that to provoke any conflict with the mainland. So we'll continue to have good relations with the mainland in other areas.
I mean, maybe I could just jump in here because I'm curious to probe a bit on the kind of US-China relationship. Is the fact that US-China relations are getting worse. There's a major rivalry between the two, whether you call it a Cold War or anything else. Is this a danger to Taiwan? Does Taiwan risk getting sucked into this conflict?
Obviously, good relations between Washington and Beijing is good for Taiwan. And in our part, we think we could play a role in cross-strait relations in order to actually reduce the tension between mainland China and the United States. So I always call for the United States or other Western countries to encourage Taiwan to have a dialogue with the mainland.
So when you look at the debate in the United States about China, which is highly critical of China, which is really gearing up for a generation of conflict, are you worried that it's going too far, that the US needs to take a step back?
No, I think US has its own mainland China policy for sure. But for us in Taiwan, we always keep the United States informed that we will try our best to make cross-strait relations peaceful. And that will reduce the potential conflict between US and China. Now, this is what we can do.
But if we just step back for a moment, we're approaching the end of our conversation, but to kind of look at the big picture again. So, I mean, we have a situation where you say, and I think you have this in common with the DPP, that essentially, the status quo is fine. We could continue with status quo. And you say no unification, and also no independence.
And no use of force.
No use of force. So we have that on the side of Taiwan. There is actually a fair amount of consensus between the parties on aspects of that. Then you look at mainland China. It becomes very clear that the one thing that Xi Jinping says he cannot tolerate is the status quo. He says that unification is an historic inevitability and is essential to the sort of great meta project of the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So you have Taiwan saying status quo, United States saying status quo, China saying unification. It's a major fundamental contradiction there. How do you resolve that?
When I visited the mainland earlier this year, I talked to the officials and tell them that, of course I understand Xi Jinping or the Chinese Communist Party would like to see the two sides of the Taiwan Strait united. But I said, for the issue of unification, I think it has to be done, first, peacefully, second, democratically. If not, then people in Taiwan will not accept. So they have to think about that. Peaceful and democratic.
And is there any peaceful democratic pathway to unification that you can imagine?
That would, of course, they could come up with ideas of how Taiwan and mainland should be united, but it should not go beyond peaceful and democratic. But this is something I think if they want to do, certainly we could change the status quo if a peaceful and democratic approach is proposed. Certainly we can discuss that.
But why not then? I mean, if you turn that around, that's essentially, why don't you say to China, you have to give up your threat of the use of force? I mean, this is the ultimate problem, right? I mean, this is what creates the risk of war, is China saying, we reserve the right to use force. Why not demand that from them? If you want to talk to us at all, take away this threat of force.
Xi Jinping, I think, recently said, he said cross-strait relations, they will handle that through peaceful unification. But they will not give up the use of force. That's their position. I think at least we can, if we had a chance to discuss this question, we said, you have to keep in mind, in order to get the support of the Taiwanese people, you have to be peaceful and democratic. But whether they will accept unification is something for them to decide.
Yeah, but I mean, just to throw that question back at you, because I didn't quite hear an answer there. Why not simply demand that Beijing says, okay, we promise we will never use force. That would de-escalate the situation by the click of a finger.
Well, I'm not Beijing. I wouldn't give you that answer. They probably would never accept that. They would.
Why not demand it? Why just sit back and think, okay, they won't accept it, so we won't even ask?
No. I think we said they said that their relations with Taiwan will be peaceful, but they will not give up using force, right?
But that's the problem.
That's a problem. Yeah, that's why we have to discuss that with them and trying to persuade them that if he continue to take the use of force as the last resort, probably you will never get Taiwan.
Thank you very much for your time.
Ma Ying-jeou, thank you very much.
Thank you.